Well, welcome back, everybody, to our series on biblical scholarship. Today, I have the privilege of introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Gary A. Rendsburg, who is a professor at Rutgers University. For those who do not know Dr. Rendsburg, he serves as the Blanche and Irving Laurie Professor of Jewish History and holds the rank of Distinguished Professor in the Department of Jewish Studies at Rutgers. His teaching and research focus on all things ancient Israel, as he puts it, primarily language and literature, though also history and archaeology. His second interests include ancient Egypt, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hebrew manuscript tradition, and Jewish life in the Middle Ages. Professor Rendsburg is the author of 7 books and about 200 articles, and his most recent book, which we're here to talk about today, How the Bible is Written, published by Hendrickson in 2019, focuses on the use of language to create literature in the Bible. Welcome, Dr. Rendsburg. Glad to have you with me today.
It's great to be here, Chris. Thanks for arranging for the interview. It's an honor to be with you and share all this wonderful biblical scholarship with the audience.
Yeah, well, I am just so excited. I have my copy here of How the Bible is Written, and have really been enjoying it. But before we get into the book, tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you get into the field of biblical scholarship?
As an undergraduate at the University of North Carolina in the 1970s, I was an English major. Just as an aside, I've talked to many colleagues of ours who were of my generation. There was no real Jewish studies yet. You could major in religion. Back in those years, many of us started in English literature. I'm talking about people like James Kugel and John Levinson and others who've told me, yes, of course, that was our first field. And the wonder of that is that you really learn to read a text. You learn to pay attention to language. You learn how literature operates, what authors do, the historical context in which they live, and so on. In my case, at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, as an English major, I focused especially on Middle English and Renaissance English. So Chaucer and Shakespeare, but other writers of the time as well, of those centuries. And I credit my English professors, both of the 2 main ones have passed away by now, for teaching me how to read a text, and we'll call it philology. And of course, when you do Chaucer in particular, anything in Middle English, you're now dealing with a more ancient variety of our own English language, an older variety of our English language. But that taught me how to read a text. And I was going to go off and do a PhD in English. I was going to be the world's next great expert on Christopher Marlowe, for example, Shakespeare's playwright, contemporary, close friend and collaborator at times. And in the summer between my junior and senior year, I switched over and decided to go on to graduate school in Hebrew studies. So as an undergraduate, I was taking courses in the religion department, did not have enough to double major, almost did. And at the time, you will know our colleague Eric Myers was a young scholar. He had only recently arrived at Duke University, and Jack Sasson was at UNC. And the 2 universities, which are only 8 miles apart, great basketball rivals, but decided to collaborate on academic programs. And in particular, Eric was imported from Duke to come to Chapel Hill and teach. And Carol Myers, his wife, was also there, just getting started in her career. And they had a major influence over me as an undergraduate, and we remained close ad hayom hazeh until the present day. And it was their influence, and I was taking biblical Hebrew. I always loved languages. I grew up in a bilingual home. In our home, German and English were both spoken, especially when my grandmother lived with us. And so I was attuned to sort of language and even dialects within German, since my parents came from different parts of Germany. So it was a natural thing for me to sort of just be attracted to the whole concept of literature. And then I went off and did my PhD. As I said, I switched tracks, and instead of doing the PhD in English, I went to NYU, New York University, where I had the great fortune of studying with one of the greatest scholars of the 20th century in our field, Cyrus Gordon, who was near the end of his career. He was then in his 70s. And I did my PhD under his mentorship, graduating from NYU in 1980. So, and I've never looked back. I've never looked back. So I still occasionally pick up a Chaucer, look at a Chaucer this or that, and still love to watch Elizabethan or Jacobean theater. But I have, as you know, just spent my entire career now, and it's 41 years of university teaching since the time I graduated. And I love it. I'm still energized every time I explore a new topic or walk into the classroom or give a public lecture.
So as a, former seminary professor, I know that, for me, I love the research, but I love being connected with the students. And every professor is different. Some people just want to be in the books all the time. Some people really prefer the classroom. What is it about being in the classroom that you enjoy the most?
When you have inquisitive students who just want to learn and want to know more, it just energizes you as well. I have a couple of absolutely wonderful students. So when I taught at Cornell for 18 years, we had a small graduate program. So there, of course, you're really, involved with higher level aspects of scholarship and, exploring arcane grammatical issues in Ugaritic and so on. At Rutgers, almost all of my teaching is at the undergraduate level. We don't have a graduate program in Jewish studies, although we do have one in religion. So there is some connection between my work and their work. And I've had the opportunity to be on some committees in the history department and so on as well. So it's mainly undergraduate teaching, and we're looking at, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and they come in bright-eyed, and they just, some of them come with great Bible skills, sometimes just knowing it in English, sometimes knowing it in Hebrew, and their thirst for knowledge. They want to know, they haven't been exposed to the archaeology of ancient Israel or medieval Hebrew manuscripts or whatever it is, Dead Sea Scrolls, whatever it is that enlivens our field and allows us to shed light on the biblical text. So I love those students. They're great. We have a select number of majors in Jewish studies and religion. Most of my courses are cross-listed. Some of them are cross-listed in history as well. And, they ask these great questions, and sometimes I'm, at home in the evening, tracking down the answer. That's what we do.
Yeah, so you mentioned the great questions. Now, I know from experience that sometimes those great questions can lead to, there can be differences of perspective, let's say, in the classroom. People will come with, maybe a more secular perspective. Other people will be informed by philosophy or by their religious worldview. How do you handle those types of conflicts that approach in the classroom?
Well, for people who do not know, we are a public university. Rutgers, in fact, has the great distinction of being the only state university in the country not named after the state. So we're not like the University of Texas or the University of Michigan. We are Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. And for historical purposes, the university was founded as a private college in the colonial period, one of the oldest universities in the country. 1766, 10 years before independence, as a Dutch Reformed college, and New Brunswick Theological Seminary, which abuts our campus, is still there as a Dutch Reformed seminary, the oldest one in the United States, actually. So we got started with those church affiliations, but that's true, of course, of many, many universities in the Northeast in particular, which became less church connected. So Rutgers eventually, in the 20th century, became the state university. So we are a large public state university, and sort of what you said there is true. I mean, everybody comes with all sorts of interest, knowledge, background, religious, non-religious. So the vast majority of our students are going to be Jewish and Christian they take intro to Bible or Jewish history. But we get Hindu students and Muslim students. They've heard about the Bible. They want to know what it's more about. They know Jewish history a little bit about it, and they want to learn more of it in depth. And I play off the knowledge of all of these students. As to the specific question you're asking, basically I tell the students, and I think they know this, I respect everybody's personal beliefs. I've got Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians and totally secular people, and we're all in the same classroom. And basically what I tell them is we're here to disclose or unfold the world of ancient Israel when we're dealing with the Intro to Bible, for example. These texts were composed, let's say, 3,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago. I want to know what was the original intent, the authorial intent, and how did his, I would say his or her, but almost undoubtedly they're all male authors, how did his audience understand, this passage in Isaiah or that passage in Psalms or whatever it is? And I tell them that you need to immerse yourself in that world, right? I actually make the joke. I tell them, I say with some seriousness, I lived 3,000 years ago, and I make guest appearances in the 21st century to teach courses at Rutgers University. So, and I want them to join me in that world and the immersion of that world, and to determine what we can know. And for this, of course, we rely on our colleagues, especially field archaeologists and people who work in ancient Egypt and Babylonia and so on, to uncover so much of the ancient world. These would have been the things that the Israelites knew. Any person in ancient Israel had a worldview and had a knowledge base which is there when a biblical text says, whatever it might be, the X, and behind that X or underneath, I say this is the Bible, underneath that Bible, there's a whole world which we only have a small window into, but it's our job to uncover it. And then they can take this and, run with it or not as much as they would like, depending on their own personal views. The vast majority of the students are open to this. And of course they are, because they've come to a major research university to learn, right? This is what they're doing.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the world of the Bible. So many of those watching presumably know very little about the world of the Bible. When they open up the Hebrew Bible, or as some will refer to it as the Old Testament, I'll kind of go back and forth with those terms just because the viewers are going to, certain viewers will be familiar with one, others
right.
with the other. Tell us about the world of the Bible, because I've heard so many people say, I've tried reading through the Hebrew scriptures, but I'm lost almost as soon as I start. Why is that?
Well, it is, look, it's, King David, just to pick a major personage, is 3,000 years ago. The language is not related to English. It's a totally different way of expressing this or that. We should say the following, actually. And I think any reader of the Bible knows this, but we don't think about it all the time. And that is the biblical stories. It's one of the things I try to do in the book. The biblical stories, the nature of ancient Hebrew narrative. Let's just talk about the prose for the moment, which is easier than the poetry. The prose is written in very terse, succinct language with a minimal number of words, sometimes with an ellipsis of a scene. So if you take the Abraham story in Genesis, it's Genesis 12 through 25, and even parts of that at the end are not all that central to the main story, which is Genesis 12 through 22. That's a tiny little bit of Bible or anything. That would be a 400-page novel in English, right? In the modern world, you would write an entire novel, or, any of these mega biographies that the great biographers write on Alexander Hamilton or John Adams, or, and all we have is just, we meet him, he's 75 years old, and, years go by and nothing happens. Similarly with the story of Jacob. He meets Rachel at the well, and then, in one verse, 7 years have passed and the next scene happens, okay? That's a key verse, by the way. It's one of my favorite verses, which I point out in the book as well. I'll get back to that in just a second. So a good part of it is adjusting your readerly expectations as to how a story is told, right? Not everything is given to you. The text demands readerly input. So, in a 400-page novel, everything is given to you, or a 600-page biography if you want to talk about nonfiction. And in the biblical text, things are not given to you. So you just have to, I mean, you know, the classic example is Genesis 22. You know, Sarah is totally absent from the story. So when Abraham received the divine word that he's supposed to go off and sacrifice his son Isaac, and I tell this to my students somewhat with humor, but always with great sincerity, didn't he turn to Sarah and say, like, you're not going to believe what he told me to do now? He just goes off, right? Yeah. Sarah's not there. You know, this would be unheard of in our own societies. And so these kinds of, and we have to explore why Sarah's not there. I have answers for this when I work through these stories with the students. And by the way, the rabbis noted this. They observed already in the ancient midrashic literature that, you know, which is, let's say, 1700 years ago, the absence of Sarah, and they tried to explain these things. I mean, this is not new to notice her absence. It's only how we explain it versus the way perhaps the rabbis explained it. They were more sermonic and hermeneutical, and we're more a little literary in our approaches. So these are, I think, some of the issues that stand between the modern reader and the ancient reader. And whenever I say reader, and this is certainly something I emphasize in the book, as you now know, Chris, from having read it, the reader of an ancient text was the listener to an ancient text. We in the modern world read silently. We use our eyes. We process words visually. But in the ancient world, not just Hebrew, everything in the ancient world, literature was produced orally. So you have what I call the oral effect, O-R-A-L from the mouth, A-U-R-A-L into the ears. One person held the text, you know, on some papyrus scroll in ancient Israel. Later they would use parchment, but if you go back to the biblical period, mainly a papyrus scroll. One person held the text and read it aloud, and everybody listened. Or maybe without a text and just knew it by heart, which is also very possible. So the processing of a text is going to be very different from ancient Israel to, you know, our modern world. So all of these are features that sort of create some distance. That's why the listeners to this need to, you know, listen to more of Chris Dost's interviews and listen to more, explore more of this, and, you know, come take our courses. Right. And attend our public lectures and so on, because these are the issues which are a bridge that we need to. It is a divide which we need to bridge before we can really begin to start reading and understanding how the Bible works and how to make sense of it.
Talk to us a little bit about why it is that readers are really listeners. Why is that the case in ancient Israel?
Well, before the age of printing. Remember, printing is the printed book. All the books on my bookcase, all the books on your bookcase, these are artifacts of modernity. Printing doesn't get created until the middle of the 15th century. Johannes Gutenberg, Mainz, Germany. And once he creates movable font and you get the printed book, his first book is the Latin Bible, but quickly, of course, other books get printed, Hebrew font gets created. And you can now create 300 copies of the same book, or several thousand copies, as we now, right? Or in the case of bestsellers today, millions of copies. And everyone looks alike. Every book looks alike. My copy of my book and your copy of my book are exactly the same. So we can all have a copy. We don't need somebody reading to us necessarily. And so we have this adjustment into silent reading. But in antiquity, or before, you know, into the Middle Ages, before the age of printing, there might have been just one copy. Every single book, every single composition had to be written out by hand. And how many copies could you possibly have of any text, whether it's Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you go back to the Gilgamesh epic in ancient Babylonia, or the story of Sinuhe in ancient Egypt. We know these were popular texts, and we have multiple copies, but at any given time, you know, how many would have been circulating in any society? So you relied on someone who was a presenter, or what I would call a performer of the text, who hopefully used, you know, different voices and different emphases and so on to highlight, and dramatic pauses. Join me in my little fantasy world where I assume that this was happening.
Right.
Sociologists or more anthropologists have studied this when they've gone to cultures, pre-literate cultures. It's poetry, but Somali poetry, recitations, and so on in Somalia, where the people actually know the poetry and they listen to the poet. We don't do that much anymore. We go to poetry readings. You can still see this in the in the theater, let's say, right? I mean, where you actually are processing the text through your ears, or perhaps watching a movie. But book stuff, of course, is done through silent reading, because they're also available to us, as that great collection of books behind you shows. Right.
So let's talk about the Bible for a minute. What is the Hebrew Bible? And just again, for clarification for those who are listening, when I use the term Hebrew Bible, I'm referring to what in Judaism is referred to as the Tanakh, what in Christianity is often referred to as the Old Testament. I generally use the term Hebrew Bible or Hebrew Scriptures. So could you tell the listeners, in your opinion, what is the Hebrew Bible?
Well, I mean, there's the very basic part, and I'll give you my grand definition, but let's do, which I thank you for the question. I actually have a grand definition of it. But let's start with the very basics. So it is an anthology. It's an anthology of books from ancient Israel, which covers approximately a 1,000-year period of literary productivity. So those are the extremes. I'm going to say from around 1150 BCE down to 150 BCE. But we have very little of that very archaic material, a few poems such as Exodus 15 and Judges 5. And we really only have one outlier at the other end, which is the book of Daniel, written in the 2nd century BCE. The vast majority of the Bible, 95% of it, is written in about a 600-year period. Let's say from 1000 BCE, the time of King David, down to around 400 BCE, the end of the prophetic material and other late books at that time as well. But still, even a 600-year range of literature is quite remarkable, and it's an anthology that gets put together. So the first 5 books tell the basic stories that everybody knows in Genesis, and then Exodus through Deuteronomy, focusing on Moses, the legal traditions of Israel, the ritual traditions of ancient Israel, the Torah or Pentateuch. And then you have historical books and prophets and miscellaneous writings such as Psalms and the Book of Job and so on. So eventually all of this coalesced into something like a canon. I say like a canon because although the Jewish tradition holds to 24 books, that's the way the Jews count. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel is a single book. 1 Kings, 2 Kings, a single book, and so on. So if you use that system, it's 24 books. The way the Christians count, it's 39 books, because the 12 minor prophets, which is a single book in the Jewish tradition, is 12 books in the Christian tradition. And of course, there is no Christian tradition. There is no the Christian tradition, because the Protestant tradition is a smaller Old Testament than the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox one, and so on. But eventually something like a canon is created in the Jewish tradition by, let's say, the 2nd or 3rd century CE. There's a pretty much agreement these are the books that are the Bible, and as I said, they're counted up to be 24. And then there's all the genres, right? The 2 big genres are prose versus poetry. Prose is prose, fine. But within the poetry, you've got Psalms, you've got Proverbs, you've got prophetic literature, most of which is poetic. You've got lamentations over the destruction of Jerusalem in the Book of Lamentations, 5 separate poems written after the year 586 when Jerusalem was destroyed. You've got the Song of Songs, love poetry. Just think of the variety, right? If you go back to the prose, you've got prose narrative storytelling, which is the most of it, but you've got all these laws in the Torah. You've got descriptions of sacrifices in the Torah, which is a guidebook for the priests as to how to do these things. Most of us don't open up Leviticus chapter 5 and say, oh, let's see what we have to do. But it's all there, right? But my main definition, my grand definition of the Bible is as follows, and this is the Jewish Bible. My main definition is the Bible is the record of God's relationship with humanity, especially one small subset of humanity, the people of Israel. And the camera within that God-Israel relationship, the camera remains tenaciously on humanity. We get very few visions of God. The camera, by camera I mean the setting, the camera rarely goes into heaven where we can see what God is doing. It's always here on earth. The two exceptions are Job chapters 1 and 2, where God has a conversation with the Satan figure, which is really not the devil of later Christianity, but the adversarial angel. And that story is it's not real, right? It's a parable. The rabbis of old already recognized that. And the one other place where we get a view of heaven is Ezekiel chapter 1, which is so difficult to read. And in fact, the Jewish tradition even tells one not to even read it till the age of 30 or 40 or something like that, because it is so difficult. So we don't get these glimpses of heaven, or those are the only two that come to mind, very quick glimpses of heaven, very few others. It is tenaciously on humanity. We follow Abraham, we follow Jacob, we follow Joseph, we follow Moses, right? We follow David and Saul, and then David and his wives and his sons and daughters, right? It's always right here on earth. So I'll repeat that, right? It is the record of God's relationship with humanity. Let me pause there and talk about the universalistic, because the Torah begins with those first 11 chapters in Genesis. The covenant with Noah is representative of God's concern for all of humanity. So there's this universalistic aspect. And you get that in a few other places in the Bible, but it very quickly focuses on the small subset of humanity, the people of Israel, from Abraham onward. So it is the record of God's relationship with humanity, especially the small subset called the people of Israel. But remarkably, that camera remains almost always focused on what happens here on earth. It is so human. That's why we're still reading it 3,000 years later. It's so human.
Do you see a central thread through the Hebrew scriptures or the Hebrew Bible?
Wow, that's a great question. Single thread. Well, the single thread would be observance of the covenant, upholding the covenant, which in the biblical tradition is defined as following God's commandments, brings you reward and blessing. And breaking the covenant, which is described and defined as not observing the commandments, brings about destruction. And so this is the tale, right? It eventually yields. So when Israel follows the commandments, they prosper. Okay. Saul doesn't follow the word of God that Samuel told him to do on multiple occasions, and eventually it leads to his death on the battlefield and the loss of the kingdom. David, the major exception, of course, of the story of Bathsheba and Uriah, is held up as one who does follow God's law, and even when he does sin, he repents for it in 2 Samuel chapter 12, very seriously repents for it. And so his sin is forgiven, although there's still punishment that will occur. So this is the grand thread, and eventually, right, both the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, after Solomon, when the kingdom splits into two, both kingdoms will eventually come to an end because they abrogate the word of God. You and I, if we were writing the Bible today, we're writing the record of ancient Israel as neutral historians. We would explain this in all sorts of ways. Mostly, Assyria was the greatest war machine the world had ever seen. Little old Israel could never stand up to Assyria. And then a century plus later, Babylonia was a great war machine, and little Judah could not possibly stand up to Babylonia, no different than all the other little kingdoms around, which fell under Assyrian and then later on Babylonian imperial rule. But the biblical author never says anything about this. You know, Israel didn't get swallowed up by Assyria, and Judah didn't get swallowed up by Babylonia because they didn't have enough army, or they didn't have enough chariots, or they didn't have enough, weapons. It was simply because they didn't follow the law of God. And that's the theme, right? And that's the theme. And then you do get the hope and promise of the exilic period and the post-exilic period and the reestablished small and fledgling, but with the hope for a complete renewal in the kingdom of Judah, the province of Judah, now part of the Persian Empire, and the centrality of Jerusalem. The other thread we should mention, of course, is, I just used the word hope, that positive hope. That just comes through in the prophets, right? No matter how bad ththings are, even Jeremiah, right?
Well, I was gonna ask you about that, because the Hebrew scriptures, as you know, get such a bad rap, and it's often described in Christian circles, that I've heard it said so many times, the God of the Old Testament is a God of anger, the God of the New Testament is a God of love. And obviously I understand that the picture is far more complex than that. So I hear you taking giving a positive, more positive and hopeful reading of the Hebrew scriptures.
Yeah, no, very much so. I think that look, the prophets infuse hope and the promise for a better time. Look, Amos, the earliest of the writing prophets is Amos, middle of the 8th century BCE. Chapter after chapter, how horrible the people of Israel are. And then you get to the chapter 9 and, there's this promise for the future, right? Or Hosea, the next prophet, chapters 1 and 2, Israel is to be punished for all of its sins, and yet embedded in there are these passages of hope and promise of what will be. So this is just built into the tradition. It's built into this idea that the world will be a better place than it is today. And that's not even, the word, obviously the word Messiah appears, but the sort of later post-biblical messianic ideas of Judaism and Christianity are not really in the Bible. There are seeds in the Jewish Bible. There's seeds there, but those seeds are also should be mentioned here. Isaiah chapter 11. Let's just use Isaiah chapter 2. I just mentioned Assyria. Assyria is the war machine par excellence in the ancient world. You go into the British Museum or the Metropolitan Museum or the Brooklyn Museum, and you see these incredible palace reliefs, and they're all militaristic, right? You've got the king and the chariots and the army marching and this and that. This is what the Assyrians did in their glorified war in their palace reliefs. And it's exactly at that time in the late 8th century BCE that Isaiah has the great vision of nation shall not you shall beat your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks, and nation shall not learn war anymore. And there you have it. How did you have that all queued up already? Hey?
Yeah, so, I figured I'd put the text up so that the the viewers can pause if they want and quickly glance at it.
Yeah. So it's not, look, these words would have been brilliant at any time they were spoken. But when you realize they're spoken at the very time that Assyria has destroyed Israel and is actually besieging Jerusalem, we don't know the exact date of Isaiah's, he prophesied over the course of about 40 years. We don't know exactly when this was issued, but those are the general time. And I now have to always take a break, as I do with my students, because when we read Isaiah chapter 2, I say, okay, now turn to Micah chapter 4, because the same words appear in his exact contemporary, another prophet in Judah, Micah, who's so little known because he's one of the minor prophets, and everybody holds it up to be Isaiah's. There you have Micah chapter 4. You see, it's the same words, and these are exact contemporaries with one another. And it actually, I use this, right? Out of Zion shall go forth and so on, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Here's the swords and the plowshares and the spears and the pruning hooks again. I actually use this passage to illustrate an important point about literature, going back to that. Today, literature has a copyright, right? There's a copyright in my book and your book and everybody's book. And when the author owns the copyright, and the name of the author is known. In ancient Israel, we don't know the names of these authors. They're all anonymous. And that's true of Babylonia, Assyria, Egypt, all these greats. We don't know who wrote the Gilgamesh epic. We don't know who wrote the story of Senuhe, which is the classic from ancient Egypt. We will sometimes know the name of the scribe who left us his name to say he copied this. But in the Near Eastern tradition, you don't own your literature. That was true in Greece, where we know the names of all the authors, the poets, Homer and Hesiod, the historians, Herodotus and Thucydides, the great philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, the playwrights, Aeschylus, Euripides, and so on. We know the names of the people because in that European sphere, apparently, the literature was associated with an author. In the ancient Near East, including ancient Israel, that's not the case. So literature belonged to a community, and we don't know who wrote Genesis and Exodus and so on. Those are the great debates of biblical scholars. I'm trying to figure out when they were written, what century, and so on.
Well, people are going to say here, they're going to say, wait a second, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible.
Right, we'll get to that, right.
All right, so you're going to address that, okay.
Right, so the only exception to my comment is the prophets, where we do know the names. We know the name of Isaiah, we know the name of Micah, and Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and all the other prophets I've mentioned, Amos, Hosea, and so on. So those are known to us. Because they were giving the divine word, and the divine word apparently was, that's the definition of a prophet, someone who speaks the divine word. It has the Hebrew word and even the Greek word prophetos, which comes into English as prophet, does not mean someone who tells the future, right? It actually means a spokesperson or something like that. The Hebrew word navi means something like a spokesperson, based on a Semitic root, which means to speak. So the texts are communal, which is why Isaiah and Micah can have the same text. And as I tell my students, neither prophet violated the other's copyright, because there's no such thing. They just belong to a community, and you can use the same material. And of course, we have other examples of that. Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are essentially the same psalm with slightly different words. Right, so by Jewish tradition, and accepted by Christian tradition as well, the first 5 books are the 5 books of Moses. But already in the 13th century, we have a Jewish luminary in medieval Spain, Abraham ibn Ezra, who did not deny that statement, but he said there are parts which were not written by Moses. And then in the 17th century, the great Jewish scholar who really ushers in modernity, Benedict Spinoza in Amsterdam, says this explicitly. And that, of course, leads to the whole endeavor, the whole enterprise of modern biblical scholarship. So, people who were engaging in our field no longer view these books as the work of Moses. He is clearly the dominant personage in 4 of the 5 books, Exodus through Deuteronomy. And at the end of Deuteronomy, it does say that Moses wrote this down, but it's not clear if he wrote down Deuteronomy or just the poem that follows in Deuteronomy 32 and so on. So to my mind, these texts are post-Moses. I certainly, when I look at the Pentateuch, focus on the 10th century BCE, the time of David and Solomon. There's a chapter in the book about that as well, why I think that's the case. So yeah, so the 5 books of Moses is a traditional term, both amongst Jews and Christians, but modern biblical scholarship, we live in an age of humanism, and we are driven by humanistic research. So we try to uncover when these things, it doesn't, has nothing to do with the message. The message remains the same. It's just that the historical reality is that these texts are from a few centuries after Moses.
I want to come back to something you said earlier about the historical texts. You referred to, the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel and the Babylonian conquest of the southern kingdom of Judah. And I'm going to paraphrase what you said, but you seem to insinuate that if we were to write a history of ancient Israel today, we would look at the external forces that brought about the demise of these two kingdoms, whereas the quote unquote historical books in the Bible see it a different way. And it seems that what you're really calling attention to is that what we call the historical books really maybe belong to a different genre, that it's not really history in the modern sense of the word. Would you agree with that? Could you expound upon that?
Right. So it is as historical as anything you're going to find in the ancient Near East, which is to say, let's just focus on the Book of Kings. Everything in the Book of Kings has been confirmed by archaeological and historical evidence from elsewhere. So the names, there are several dozen kings, both of Israel and Judah, mentioned post-Solomon. And we're talking about people like Omri and Ahab, and later on Hezekiah and Manasseh. These names appear in Aramaic, Moabite, Syrian, and Babylonian inscriptions, right? So, and in the exact same order that they are in the Bible. So it is as historical as anything. We can't say that about Genesis. We can't say that about Genesis and Exodus, right? We don't have an Abraham or Isaac or Jacob mentioned anywhere. But with these, this is why I call these the historical books. Okay, they really do present the history of Israel in a fashion that any historian can rely on. The issue is that the history is seen through the prism of the theology of ancient Israel. So thank you for the follow-up question, right? So just because the kingdom of Israel is destroyed because they didn't follow the word of God doesn't mean that you throw out the whole history of Israel that's recorded there. It's real history. We know these people from other ancient Near Eastern sources. And ditto for the kingdom of Judah. And so it is the accuracy of all of a sudden the chronology is very accurate in the Book of Kings. Up until Solomon, including Solomon, everything happens in 40-year periods. David rules for 40 years, Solomon reigns for 40 years. If you go to the Book of Judges, the judge was judging for 40 years, sometimes half that, 20, sometimes twice that, 80. Obviously, Moses lives to 120, and the Israelites wander for 40 years, and so on. So you have these 40-year set periods. But once you get to the time of after the death of Solomon, kings rule 2 years, 18 years, 23 years, whatever it is, just not random numbers, real historical figures, which gives us a very accurate chronology from around 930 BCE down to 586 BC. We have a very accurate chronology, and all of those years are then corresponding very closely to references, especially in the Babylonian and Assyrian material, because we have good chronologies because of the wealth of cuneiform material from Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq. So that's why I call them historical. And to my mind, the stories of David and Solomon don't have that confirming evidence from outside the Bible, but they certainly, are historical in the same sense. I'm sure David made Jerusalem the capital. I'm sure Solomon built the temple there.
Okay. So in the Jewish tradition, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are referred to as the former prophets. So would it be correct to say that the Book of Kings, then, in your estimation, is indeed historically reliable for the most part in the modern sense of the word, but that the writers are more interested in a prophetic or theological view of history?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, and well, first of all, I mean, the best place to see that theological yardstick, the whole Bible comes to us from Judah, Jerusalem in particular. So when you read the book of Kings, without exception, every single king of the northern kingdom is a sinner. From the mere fact that they broke away from the dynasty of David and Solomon, set up a separate rival kingdom in the northern part of the country with a new capital city and 2 new temples, one in Dan and one in Bethel. I mean, by the mere fact that they did that, they are sinful, because God promised David and renewed it with Solomon that their descendants would remain on the throne forever, which they do in the kingdom of Judah. It's just that those other people in the kingdom of Israel, the northern tribes, seceded. So even a great king like Jehu, who removes Baal worship from the land and is praised for doing that in the beginning of the book of 2 Kings, when he dies, the same refrain occurs, because he led Israel to commit sins, even though he obviously did wonderful work to remove the polytheistic influences of Baal worship from Israel. So yes, that's the theological yardstick. And when you get to Judah, the 2 kings who are held up as the best of the kings are Hezekiah and Josiah. And then when a king sins, that king is criticized for, the most famous being Manasseh. So, but that doesn't. But this very Manasseh, we know him from Assyrian records, so he's historical.
Right. So it's historically reliable, but it's really the focus that we need to think about, that the goal of the ancient history writers is not to answer our modern historical questions, but to
right.
take a theological point through history.
For an American audience, this may help as an analogy, right? We had in the 19th century this concept of manifest destiny, which brought Americans from the East Coast across the West all the way to the Pacific Ocean. That was the whole manifest destiny thing. So, there's I don't know if it's theological, but it's certainly ideological in the American story. But it doesn't mean that the whole thing's invented. The history is that Americans eventually, reached the Pacific Ocean and, gave us all the land east of the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi as well. So does that analogy help, right? You have this whole
absolutely.
manifest destiny ideology. You can remove that if you want, but the history is still the history that we tell in America.
Right, absolutely. Well, I want to talk for just a few minutes about literary devices in the Bible, because your book focuses on, well, as the title says, how the Bible is written. And the chapter that would be most familiar to a broad audience would be Genesis chapter 1,
Right.
which is after the introduction, the first main chapter of the book. So we are, most listeners are familiar. The standard translation of the story begins, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." What's going on here in this story? And how does your reading of this story differ from traditional interpretations?
So as we segue into some of the more details about the book, I should, and since you've already deep into the book, Chris, the opening words of the book are something like the following. Learned colleagues have written books with titles, who wrote the Bible, how to read the Bible, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all important, of course. My question that I'm asking is how the Bible is written, which is to say, and then I say the following: I'm interested, of course, in the content of the Bible, as we've been talking about now for almost an hour, but the book is really about how the authors tell that content, how they relate that material. So that's what this book is about, how the Bible is written. And several people have asked me, present tense, not past tense, not how the Bible was written, which would suggest, oh, they got some ink and they had a reed pen and they got some papyrus and they wrote it, right? How the Bible was written. This is how the Bible is written. It's a living text, obviously, for those of us who study this, who come to it through Jewish or Christian or other perspectives. And so I use the present tense, how the Bible is written, which also brings the author, the reader rather, back to that time period and how it's happening. So Genesis chapter 1, right? And I do start out with that because specifically for the reason you just mentioned, it is such a familiar text to everybody. These are the little things that we don't think about again. Maybe we go back to what we said earlier, what's the backstory to all the stuff that we're reading in the Bible. So different translations handle the first 3 verses of Genesis differently. And there's a great debate among scholars as to how to handle this. This ESV, English Standard Version, right?
Yes.
ESV, treats verse 1 as its own complete sentence. The very first word of the Bible, Bereshit, is already followed by the second word, which Chris can now highlight, bara, is a grammatical conundrum. This is just, you start out with an entire ungrammatical sentence, if I can put it that way. If I were to translate this literally into English, it would be, in the beginning of, God created. Right? Now, after the word of in English, you have to have a noun. But here and I don't mean, in the Hebrew, the created comes before God. It's followed by a verb. In the beginning of, God created. It sounds ungrammatical in English. That's the way it is in Hebrew. So we have to figure out how to translate that into English, first of all. I think the author is intentionally setting the stage. Look, when he wrote this, he didn't know that this would be the beginning of the Bible and people would still be reading this 3,000 years later. But it so happens that the Bible begins with this grammatical difficulty, which has been debated since the Middle Ages, certainly in the Jewish tradition, in commentaries written in Hebrew. So I think it's probably not a complete sentence. I think it is I would translate it in the beginning of God's creating the heaven and the earth, dash, the earth was unformed and void, etc., 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 dash, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So everything in verse 2 is describing the state of the earth before God created, set about to create. Now, the concept of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, is a post-biblical idea. There are some antecedents to it, but it eventually becomes a major part of medieval theology, both amongst Jewish and Christian theologians of the Middle Ages. Creation out of nothing, that is to say, there was nothing, and then God created. But that's not what the biblical text says. If you again go back 3,000 years and you put yourself in the world of an ancient Israelite and you know how to read this in Hebrew or a good English translation, the first verse in the beginning of God's creating the heaven and the earth is a introduction, and then it tells you that the earth was like this, was such and such. So these various words, which I'll come back to in just a second. Everything in Genesis that gets created only happens when God speaks. We call this creation by fiat, the spoken word. And God said, let there be light, is the first thing God speaks, and only then can light be created. And of course, this goes on over and over again. Day 2, twice on day 3, day 4, day 5, twice on day 6. You have this, and God said, let something happen, and then it comes into existence, as you see, for example, very simply in Genesis 1, verse 3, let there be light, and there was light. So since there is no divine speech in the first 2 verses, nothing can be created there yet. That is setting the stage. That's the pre-existent matter. Now, if you look at these nouns without form and void, those are 2 Hebrew nouns, which are, a 2-word phrase, and then the word darkness, and then the word the deep. The deep in Hebrew there refers to the sea, the abyss of the sea, the oceans of the world, and you see the face of the waters there. Except for the Spirit of God, which we'll come to in a moment, all of the nouns that you see there are imbued in ancient Hebrew and in other languages of the ancient world with negative valence. They are all, darkness is symbolic of evil. The abyss is the great oceans of the world. And we know from Tiamat, the Babylonian goddess, or Yam, the Canaanite goddess, god, these are gods of evil and destruction. So the ancient Israelite would know that words like darkness and the abyss and so on, or the deep, refer to evil things. The point being, the pre-existent earth is in a state of evil, or has an evil value to it. God brings goodness into a world pre-existing with evil, because every time God creates something, he saw that it was good, including, of course, the light, the very first thing created. So here's the way I read Genesis chapter 1, and I think an ancient Israelite would have understood this. All religious traditions have to deal with the issue of evil in the world. If you're a polytheist, it's very easy. As I just alluded to, you have evil gods. Right? So in Egypt, there's a god called Seth, and in Babylonia, there's Tiamat and others, and in Canaan, there's Yam, the sea god, and Mot, the god of death, and so on. So that's how you explain evil in the world. There are evil deities. Once you have only one God, how do you explain evil in the world? And so the author of Genesis 1, because God, of course, is the purveyor of goodness only. So another ancient religious tradition, by the way, the Zoroastrians had two deities, very dualistic, one responsible for good, one responsible for evil, the traditional religion of Iran, ancient Persia.
Very akin to God and Satan in...
And our later Jewish and Christian ideas of God and Satan is almost undoubtedly under the influence of that Persian Zoroastrian idea of the two forces. So the author of Genesis 1 wants to explain evil in the world, and as I say in the book, I think I say it, or if not, I say it in the classroom, he gets God off the hook for the existence of evil in the world. You can't blame God for the existence of evil in the world. There's a very serious point here being made. So it looks like a Sunday school story, right? Oh, that's nice. We get creation, we have light, and then we have this, and then we have that, and the sun and the moon, and eventually we have animals and the human couple. But it's all this very orderly creation. And with each step, God saw that it was good. And the refrains lead you to that. And all of this is to get you to realize that God brings goodness into a world pre-existent with evil. It is a remarkable statement. It's a very sophisticated statement. I always hasten to add, by the way, that a little known verse in the prophet whom we call Second Isaiah, probably under the same Zoroastrian influence in the 6th century BCE, actually does say that God is responsible for good and evil. He's reacting to Persian dualism. And that gets back to the point we made. The Bible is an anthology. When people say, what does the Bible say about this issue or that issue? There's never a single issue other than the oneness of God and a few other things in the covenant with Israel. For almost every point, I could show you the opposite in the Bible. Here's a good example. Genesis 1 says God is not the purveyor of evil. Isaiah chapter 45, I think it is, says God is it says he creates evil as well. I mean, it's flipping Genesis 1 on its edge to say that. So these are the great parts of the biblical material. So when you read Genesis 1, and again, this goes back to where we started our conversation, the ancient Israelite would have understood that things like darkness and so on have these negative valences, and that they are symbolic of evil. The great thing about Genesis 1, the great thing about all the biblical stories is the text never stops to tell you these things. You have to bring yourself to it. I contrast this with Aesop's fables in the Greek tradition. If you don't understand the moral, at the end, Aesop says, and the moral of the story is, right? Biblical texts never do that. It requires reader involvement, engagement. You have to figure these things out on your own, okay? Do we have time? A classic example, okay? Jacob and Rebekah deceive their father and husband, the blind, aged Isaac, so that Jacob can obtain the blessing. So Jacob is clearly punished for that deceit, right? He himself is then deceived by his own sons. Actually, before that, he's deceived by his father-in-law Laban in the switching of Rachel and Leah. And in fact, when Jacob complains, Laban says to him, "It is not done in our place," Genesis 29, "it is not done so in our place to put the firstborn, to put the younger before the firstborn." You know, I know what you did, Jacob, right? We don't do that here, okay? And then Jacob is deceived by his own sons concerning the fictional death of Joseph and so on. You know, and it's pretty clear the reader understands this. Okay, what about Rebecca? She, after all, was the one who started the whole thing. She orchestrated the deception of Isaac, and in fact, Jacob demurred at first. He said, "You know, but I have smooth skin, and my brother has the hairy skin, and I'll go before my father, and I'll bring upon myself not a blessing but a curse." And Rebecca issues those great words, "Let your curse be upon me, my son." Well, that's exactly what happens. You know, that's the last time we ever see Rebecca in the story. She is written out of the biblical record, which is to say the deaths of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are all recorded. The deaths of their wives are recorded, Sarah and then Rachel and Leah, but we never see the death of Rebecca. Jacob goes away for 20 years, lives with Laban, marries Rachel, marries Leah, has children, etc. When he returns to the land of Canaan, he's reunited with his brother Esau peacefully, even after all the strife that happened earlier. He's reunited with his now very aged father Isaac, and Rebecca is never mentioned. So the reader has to figure this out all on his or her own. There is no biblical statement which says, "You see, Rebecca brought the curse upon herself for her actions and her words glibly spoken. May the curse be upon me." You have to figure that all out on your own. I hope I've attracted the listeners to our conversation here to like begin to read the Bible with new eyes.
Yeah, it's, you know, there's that expression that we so often use, you know, we have to read between the lines. And there's an element of that that's coming out in this conversation. But part of what I'm hearing too is that you're saying we need to read the lines of the Bible a little bit more carefully before we worry about reading between the lines and seeing what is said and what's not said.
Right. The unspoken is as important as the spoken. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
I also hear, going back to Genesis 1, I hear what I'm taking away is that your approach to reading Kings is very similar to your approach to reading Genesis 1, in that they're texts that are traditionally understood as history in the church, in the synagogue, I presume, and just in popular understanding. Genesis 1 is a story about the creation of the heavens and the earth and how it happened. We even see that too with some of the debates that you'll see on PBS or something like that, where you'll get a creationist versus I think it was Ken Ham versus Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Okay.
Like and so what they were debating in that particular video, this is going back, I don't know, 5, could be 10 years now, I don't know. But, you know, Ken Ham is a literal creationist and is trying to argue that every last detail of the text is reliable history in the modern sense of the word. And Bill Nye, the Science Guy, is trying to prove that it's not. And what I, you know, told my students when I read it, and I kind of hear you saying the same thing here, is that they're both missing the point. That
clearly
the text is not about you know, confirming or refuting our understanding of how the cosmos came to be, but what the Bible says about the cosmos as it exists. Is that an apt summary?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of it. And well, first of all, as far as Kings and Genesis 1 is concerned, I should say the following. You and I, because we're products of the 20th and 21st centuries, you know, we make distinctions between fiction and nonfiction and reality and imagined world and so on. I don't think the ancient Israelite made those distinctions. I don't think anybody in the ancient world did. There was just story. So they wouldn't have said, I don't think. We know David's historical. We know Hezekiah's historical. I'm not sure about that Genesis chapter 1 story or the great flood story. I don't know that they would have made those distinctions. I think for them it was all story. So I just wanted to mention that. The issue that you raise, of course, is complicated by the fact, okay, if Genesis 1 is literally true, well, what do you do about Genesis 2? The biblical story, the biblical text has two creation stories, right? It begins with two creation stories, and they're very different from one another. So in the first creation story, the living creatures of the world are created in the order of vegetation, animals, humans. In Genesis chapter 2, the human couple is created first, then the vegetation. Am I doing this right? Yes, then the vegetation, and then God plants a garden in Eden, and then the animals. In the first story, the male and female are created at once, and in the second story, the male Adam is created first, and then the female is created towards the end of Genesis chapter 2 separately. So you have these differences in the story. So if you're going to argue that Genesis 1 is historical or scientific or something like that, then you have this other issue in Genesis 2, which leads me to one of the other great teachings that I like to show interested individuals and my students and people who are listening to this. There's a lesson to be learned even in the whole Genesis 1 and 2. Why does the Bible begin with two creation stories with these differences? The method of creation is also different. In the first story, as we said, it's creation by fiat. God speaks and it comes into existence. In the second story, it's through physical actions. And in fact, the verbs that are predicated of God are actually verbs that are predicated of humans. So the verb yatsar means to create. When God creates man, well, that same, out of clay, that same word is used for a human potter taking clay and making a pot. God plants a garden in Eden, right? It's the same verb for when a human goes and plants a tree or something. And the verb build is used there. He builds, I think it's building with Eve, right? He builds Eve out of Adam's rib or Adam's side, however we translate the word there. So those are basic human verbal actions as opposed to the grandeur of Genesis 1, where of course it's creation through divine speech. Okay, so what's going on in these two stories? And we go back to what I said earlier. Here we are, Genesis 2, right, thanks, right. So you can see it begins with the creation of man. I don't have to say humanity because it's actually just Adam, man here. And then comes the planting of the garden in verse 8, and then eventually we'll get the animals somewhere down around verse 13 or so, I think. 14 maybe. Nope, 15. There we are. Yeah. Okay, now, what's going on? The first story is cosmocentric. God in the cosmos, God in heaven, and the entire cosmos are created. The sun, the moon, the stars, the sea. The word rain isn't used there, but the waters above the firmament and the waters below the firmament implies, of course, rain. Everything in our world, in our known world, is created in Genesis 1. And humanity comes at the end. Genesis 2 fronts humanity, comes first, and it's anthropocentric. It uses verbs, as I just said, which can be predicated of humans. There's no reference to the creation of the sun and the moon and the stars and the sky, the firmament or the sky. None of that is there mentioned. And in fact, the two stories are introduced differently. The first story says, as we saw in Genesis 1:1, that God created the heaven and the earth, however we translate that. And the second story, Genesis 2 verse 4, begins with God created the earth and the heaven. So the pair is flipped because the cosmocentric first story is going to be heaven and earth, and the anthropocentric second story is going to be earth and heaven. And this goes back to my definition of the Bible before, right? The entire Bible is the record of God's relationship to humanity. Therefore, you have to have two stories of creation, the divine, more of the divine in Genesis 1, and more of the human in Genesis 2. The humans do things in Genesis 2, right? Adam tills the soil of the Garden of Eden. He names the animals, right? There's a very anthropocentric story there happening. So you need the two of those together. And once again, at the end of the two creation stories, the biblical author never stops to tell you, and that's because this is the theology of the entire Bible. He just lays the two stories out for you, and you're supposed to know this.
Right. Very different way of doing theology then. We're so used to, at least in Christian seminaries, doing systematic theology.
Right.
Where lay out the propositions and defend them. In the Hebrew Bible, it's often been said by those like Walter Brueggemann and others that we learn more about what the Bible has to say about God through what he does in the stories and not through direct statements.
Absolutely right. Nobody in ancient Israel sat down to write a theology or a philosophy of Judaism. We don't get that till the post-biblical period. Under Greek influence, where you now have philosophy, the most famous of those writers would have been Philo, 1st century CE, very much under the influence of Plato, an exact contemporary of Jesus, by the way, living in Alexandria, Egypt. And then, you get it in the Christian tradition with the church fathers, especially St. Augustine. You get people writing real theologies, and it all comes to the great flourish in the Middle Ages, Aquinas in the Christian tradition, Maimonides in the Jewish tradition. Yeah, but the Bible, we go back with what I said before. It's storytelling, right? You have to absorb the morals, the ethics, the teachings, the lessons, all of that just from reading stories.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's what I'm hearing is, and hopefully what the viewers are taking away is that linguistics and artistic style, history, theology are really all intertwined when we read the Hebrew Bible, and you can't have one without the other. It's really just a tight spider's web, as it were.
It's a wonderful way to say it. Absolutely. Complete agreement. Yeah.
Well, Gary, I can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time. All of those who are going to watch this video are the ones who will benefit from it. One more time, I just want to plug your book, How the Bible is Written. I wish we could just go on for hours and hours picking your brain, but at this point, I think we need to refer the viewers back to the book, which is just a fantastic work, a work that you should be proud of, and that is just a blessing to us all who are interested in the scriptures, regardless of our backgrounds. So thank you very much, Gary.
Can I just say one more word in closing, Chris, about the book, and it is the following. The book is intended, don't shy away if you don't know Hebrew, the book is intended for both scholars and lay people. Every single passage and every single word is presented in the Hebrew original and in English translation, and key words are transliterated. So if you don't read Hebrew at all and you know your biblical stories, you will be able to benefit from the book as well. And scholars who do know Hebrew, or seminary students or graduate students who do know Hebrew, will appreciate it from that angle as well. So I just wanted to make that clear. The book tried to find the balance between two audiences, a general, well-educated lay audience and a professional scholarly audience as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just for the sake of the viewers, I'm going to hold up a page so you can see Gary's treatment of Genesis 2:2 through 2:3, and you can see the Hebrew laid out there with the English translation. And then as you scroll down the page and you just glance at some of those Hebrew words, there's a nice convenient transcription or transliteration that you'll be able to benefit from.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely.
The yellow highlighting is Chris's, not mine.
Yes, exactly. So talking points for our conversation. So.
Great.
Well, Gary, thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody who has tuned in to watch this. And if you're interested in watching more videos like this, please be sure to subscribe to the channel and click the bell to be notified when future videos are published. Well, thanks so much, Gary. I hope you have a wonderful summer, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much, Chris, for having me. Good
All
to
right.
see you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.